Hi, this is Tracey Tokuhama-Espinosa, and this is the week on memory. Remember we talked about how memory is one of these huge building blocks for learning. Well, we want to talk about 6 big ideas within the context of this week's class. The first is that there is no new learning without memory. Remember we talked about the role of attention last week. Well, without attention and without memory, there is no such thing as learning. So that's one big idea we want to emphasize this week. The second is that there are multiple memory systems. It's not just long-term, short-term, but there's such things as sensory pathways, emotional memory pathways, and other things that make memory much more complex than we once thought. Before, people used to think, oh, you get a bump in your head, you lose your memory. Well, you would lose part of your memory because memories are stored throughout the cortex. So how are memories formed and how are they stored will be another focus of this class. We're also going to talk about this very interesting idea. Most of us really work hard to try not to forget things. Well, we want to challenge that idea in this class and help you understand that forgetting is as important as remembering. People with perfect memories can often suffer in some ways. So we will talk about the gift of forgetting as well. Fourth point has to do with that memory is a very complex process. Like everything else we've talked about in the brain, it depends on different chemical processes, electrical processes, distinct neural pathways for different types of memory systems, physical structures which serve as hubs of memory. So we want to make sure that you're thinking about this and appreciating the complexity of memory, and which is why it's so hard sometimes to learn things that maybe you might not be motivated to learn or that you don't have prior experience with. We'll talk about how memory is enhanced by having previous knowledge of information that's similar to the new target knowledge. And we'll also look at types of things that facilitate or detract from different types of learning moments related to context and also methodology, the way we teach or learn different information. The fifth point has to do with plasticity-dependent memory consolidation. So basically, plasticity is the representation, the physiological representation of all learning. But when we talk about plasticity, what we're really talking about is creating those neural networks that create some kind of a memory for information or newly learned processes in the brain. And the sixth point has to do with, again, thinking about the risk and protective factors in our own lives that prevent new learning of information or enhance the probability that we can learn new information. We'll also take a peek into the aging brain and things that can be done as protective factors to reduce the probability of having problems later on in life with neurodegenerative diseases that do have an impact on memory. So here's this big idea of learning, and at the core of learning is our memory systems and attention systems. Last week we talked a lot about attention systems. This week we're going to explore a bit about memory systems, distinct memory systems. And the idea is if we were to combine these two things, would we magically have learning? Well, the key idea here is that we know that when you are missing attention systems or you're missing memory systems, then learning is impaired. So we know that by its absence, you don't have such efficient learning, but we don't necessarily know or can't prove that the just memory plus attention equals learning, because it's a lot more complicated than that. But keep in mind that these are two fundamental systems for learning to occur. When we talk about memory, we're talking about multiple systems of memory. It's not just long-term versus short-term or procedural memory versus declarative memory, which are two types of long-term memory, or the collective memory, for example, versus an individual memory. So we're going to explore all of these different types of memory systems, in part to impress upon you the complexity of memory in the brain, but also to appreciate that different types of stimulus will create different types of memory structures. And so we know that for any school learning to occur, for example, things have to get to long-term memory. Just having them in short-term memory or working memory store does not mean that you learn things. Some people are very good at kind of faking it and having great working memory systems, and they look like they know things, but really over the long term, without getting it into long-term memory, there is no evidence of real learning. So what are the basic processes of memory? What is our basic understanding of memory? Remember we spoke about this in the very first class. All new learning occurs through your senses, right? So you have basic environmental stimuli, things that happen to you in the environment. You smell something, see something, touch something. So you have the sensory memory store, which is compared with what you've already experienced before in your life. Remember last week we talked about selective attention. Your brain cannot possibly pay attention to absolutely everything that it experiences in your environment. Your environment is so rich in stimulus that it'd be impossible to pay attention to every smell or sight or thing you could touch in your environment. So you actually have to narrow in and hone in on specific things, which is why selective memory will play a role in choosing what your brain will be paying attention to. Based on what it pays attention to, then it goes into the short-term memory store where there's also a time for comparison. We're looking to see, what do I already know about that information? How similar is it to something I already know? So where's the novelty? Where are the patterns that exist in this new stimulus that's coming into my head? Oftentimes in this stage, the information is not deemed important enough, or it's not stimulated enough or rehearsed enough to pass into long-term memory storage, and it could be lost. If it does get into long-term memory store, then there's still this terrible probability that it can be lost if it's not rehearsed. This is why the strengthening of neural pathways is so important to retrieval. If you don't have that developed, remember we talked about the myelin sheath when we talked about the basic neurophysiology of the brain. If you don't create those new pathways and then rehearse and strengthen them and have the stronger myelin sheath, which creates the speed with which you can retrieve information, it will be lost. So there's a lot of places along the way where information can be lost and filtered out and not remembered. So there's basically more ways to forget things or miss things or not learn things at all than there are to actually get them into long-term storage and use them as platforms for future learning. So what does this repetition do? Remember, we talked about this before, right? You get your sensory information, it's in hold, it can be lost at this stage if it doesn't get passed on to short-term or working memory for review or rehearsal. If it's not rehearsed, it can be lost, right? But if we finally do get into long-term storage, this really means a physiological change has taken place. This means that between the different neurons or groups of neurons, you'll have these connections along the axon, and this myelin sheath will begin to form based on repetition. So when things are repeated enough and or they have a strong enough emotional stimulus to create a very quick and fast retrieval tie early on, then it's not available for long-term retrieval, and therefore you didn't really learn it. So memory is really important across all disciplines, obviously, because it is related to learning. But the way it's interpreted is slightly different in different fields. We can go from the biology, psychology, neuroscience fields into social sciences, cultural studies, but it plays different roles in different points. When we talk about neuroscience, we might be talking about how specific groups of neurons are connected together and create neuroplasticity. That's one level of analysis. But then you can also talk about not just individual memory and what that looks like at a very molecular level, either autobiographical memory, semantic memory, these explicit memories that you can have based on school education, and or procedural memories, things like learning how to ride a bike, right? But you can also talk about memory, when you talk about cultural studies, as collective memory. How are things passed on between groups? And we did talk about this a bit when we looked into epigenetic studies and when we mentioned how certain traits, if they are considered or deemed beneficial to the survival of the species, then would be passed on through different kinds of cultural artifacts, but also through genetic potentiation. And so these are things that when we talk about memory, it's a really broad scope of things. It's going from the individual molecular level to also the influence on culture, as well as the Baldwin effect we mentioned briefly about how traits that are beneficial to the group can be passed on over generations. So if we talk about memory systems, how do we think about memory systems? One of the earlier theories that still is in play today has to do with Sperling's ideas of sensory memory. Remember we talked about how all new learning passes through the sensory systems. Well, he put a lot of stock into trying to document and figure out where iconic memory, so when you can remember something, you have a visual recall of something, or echolic memories, things that you can hear and you repeat them and you hear them over and over again, or haptic memory, which has to do with touch memory. So he had a long look at this to try to see if there were distinct neural pathways or similar neural pathways. It's really interesting. Depends on the sensory processing, but it also depends on where that information is going to end up going within your brain. If it is something that's related to definitions or the name of something, it will go in one pathway. If it has to do with a process or the way that information is used, it will go in another pathway. So these are very interesting early studies that have sort of been borne out throughout the decades. A key division here that I'd like to make, because I am very partial to this model and you don't have to be, but we used to talk about short-term and working memory as being the same thing. Now we have a big divide, which comes mainly with Badley's work, in which he showed that there's something different about working memory. Short-term memory had to do with plus or minus a certain number of digits, for example, whereas working memory has to do with processes. And in his hypothetical model back in the 70s, which has now really been borne out, which is fantastic to see that he had this future sight, is that once you have input and you receive information from your senses. He hypothesized back in the 70s, well, what was happening is that you would either log it on to some kind of a visual spatial sketchpad, like a visual image of whatever it is that you learned, or you would rehearse a phonological loop, which had to do with this repetition of something auditorially in your ear. So basically you would be hearing the same thing over and over again, or you might even speak out loud and repeat these things over and over again. The main idea was that there was another way that working memory came into play, which was very different from digit span analysis of short-term memory. So he suggested that these distinct processes, the fact that you were hanging something on a visual sketchpad or that you were putting something into a phonological loop, was enhancing your ability to use that information for later processes. And then eventually, if it did get to that stage of working memory, then it could move into long-term memory. So these terms, working memory and short-term memory, aren't always distinguished. And even today in the literature, you get many people talking about short-term memory when they're referring to models that were previously called working memory. So phonological loop, visual sketchpad, which were Baddeley's work in the 70s, talking about working memory, not short-term memory. But we have some models today that still call these things working memory, which is why I bring it up, because there is a confusion with the terms. I like the distinction between digits and processes, but you can go ahead and consider the evidence yourself. From the short-term memory, you have this big block of long-term memory, which is divided and has been for decades without a lot of challenge into two different types of long-term memory: declarative memory and non-declarative memory, or explicit memory or procedural memory. There's a lot of ways that we categorize these things to mean the same thing, but declarative memory is basically anything you could explain to me, okay? And non-declarative is stuff that would be hard to explain to me, like if I asked you, how do you walk? Okay, that's something you remember how to do it, but it's very hard to make a statement about it. Declarative memory are all the things that you would learn in a school context. So they're contextually associated. They can be episodic memories as well. They really rely highly on recollection for proof that they exist, not demonstration like in the procedural memories. And they can also be semantic in nature, memorizing definitions of different things. And they're very much based on familiarity, repetition, and practice. Just being able to retrieve long-term memories in that sense has to do with rehearsal, pure rehearsal. So again, going back to this idea, if we split hairs between short-term and working memory plays a very, very interesting role in joining these two ideas of attention and memory, which we say are vital for learning. You'll find tons of papers that have come out in about the past 8 or 9 years really focused on the key role of enhanced working memory systems in order to learn just about any subject. Or when we talk about executive functions a couple weeks ago, we mentioned that working memory was one of 3 elements: working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. But this idea of working memory is really what bridges these two ideas of attention and memory in the brain. Declarative, as we mentioned before, things that you learn in school, all the facts, events, dates, things like that. And the hippocampus is a very big hub there, right below the medial temporal lobe. When we talk about non-declarative memory, we're talking about those things that are very hard to explain. So how do you ride a bike? How do you walk? How do you talk? Those things are in a very different kind of a category. They tend to be things that are skills or habituated things. They work based on good priming. They can be related to associative learning, so related to emotional responses or triggered emotional responses that are habituated over time. And also they can be connected to non-associative learning, which have more to do with just reflexes, how you react to different situations based on habituated memory. So in summation, if you don't have short-term, you don't have working, you can't get to long-term. But the key here is you can have short-term and working without getting to long-term. And the key is for learning to get to long-term memory. So long-term memory, if we talk about it, declarative or explicit memories and non-declarative, those are the two biggies, two big categories, right? And declarative memory can have things like episodic memories, semantic memories, and then you can have non-declarative memories, which are related to more procedural habituation or skills or habits. And these are the related hubs for those memory systems in the brain. Obviously, it's not just the medial temporal lobe, which is like pretty big anyways, or diencephalon, or the basal ganglia, or the neocortex, or the amygdala. There are multiple pathways, but these are key hubs through which those memory systems pass. So now what are we going to do? We're going to turn to a couple of videos that have to do with exceptional cases of memory. People who can't learn new things because they can't memorize things, or people who can't forget things, just to get a sense of the different elements that are involved in forming memories and also in retrieving memories.
Clive Waring was playing the piano alone in his room. When his wife came into the room, he immediately leapt up and embraced her with joyful enthusiasm. A minute later, she slipped out to grab a glass of water, and when she returned, he gave her that same bright greeting as if she'd been gone for days. And then he did it again and again. Clive was an accomplished London musician until in 1985, at the age of 47, he contracted a rare herpes encephalitis virus that ravaged his central nervous system. Since then, he's been unable to remember almost any of his past or to make new memories. His wife is the only person he recognizes, but he can never recall the last time he saw her. This may be the most profound case of extreme and chronic amnesia ever recorded. Our memory helps make us who we are, whether recognizing loved ones, recalling past joys, or just remembering how to walk and talk and fry an egg. Memory is the chain that connects our past to our present. If it breaks, we're left untethered, incapable of leaving the present moment and unable to embrace the future. But memory isn't an all-or-nothing thing, of course. Waring can't remember any details about his personal past, but he still remembers how to speak English and get dressed and play the piano. Some memories you process automatically, and they are stored differently than your more personal or factual memories, like your first kiss, or how to recite pi to 12 places, or who won the Peloponnesian War. Speaking of ancient Greeks, and to help demonstrate what I'm talking about, I want you to have a look at our Spartan friend here and remember his name, because we're going to be testing your memory in just a minute. Technically, memory is learning that has persisted over time, information that has been stored and in many cases can be recalled. Except, of course, during the exam, our memories are typically accessed in 3 different ways: through recall, recognition, and relearning. And if you think about all the different kinds of tests you've taken in school, they're all actually designed to size up how you access stored information in these ways. Like, recall is how you reach back into your mind and bring up information just as you do in fill-in-the-blank tests. So if I say blank is the capital of Greece, your brain hopefully would just recall the answer as Athens. Recognition, meanwhile, is more like the multiple choice test. You only need to identify old information when presented with it, as in which of the following was not an ancient city in Greece: Athens, Marathon, Pompeii, or Sparta. And relearning is sort of like refreshing or reinforcing old information. So when you study for a final exam, you relearn things you half forgot more easily than you did when you were first learning them. Like, say, a basic timeline of the Greek Empire. But how? How does all of that data that we're exposed to all the time, every day, become memory? Well, in the late 1960s, American psychologists Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin figured out enough about the process of memory formation to break it down into 3 stages. First, it's encoded into the brain, then stored for future use, and then eventually retrieved. Sounds simple, but by now you've figured out that just because you take a lot of stuff about your mind for granted doesn't mean that it is not complicated. By Atkinson and Schifrin's model, we first record things we want to remember as an immediate but fleeting sensory memory. Think back to the image I showed you a minute ago. Do you remember his name? If you do, it's because you successfully managed to shuffle it into your short-term memory, where you probably encoded it through rehearsal. This is how you briefly remember something like a password or phone number. Like, hey Tommy, what's Jenny's number? Okay, 867-5309. 867-5309. 867-53. You're getting it in your head there. Or in this case, I told you to remember that guy's name. Maybe you were thinking Leonidas repeatedly over and over, even if you didn't think you were doing it. But this information really only stays in your short-term memory for under 30 seconds without a lot of rehearsal. So if you weren't repeating Leonidas, you probably have forgotten it already. Because your mind, amazing as it is, can really only hold between 4 and 7 distinct bits of information at a time, at which point the memory either decays or it gets transferred into long-term memory. Long-term memory is your brain's durable and ridiculously spacious storage unit holding all of your knowledge, skills, and experiences. Now, since the days of Atkinson and Schifrin, psychologists have recognized that the classical definition of short-term memory didn't really capture all of the processes involved in the transfer of information to your long-term memory. I mean, it's more than being able to just remember some Greek guy's name. So later later generations of psychologists revisited the whole idea of short-term memory and updated it to the more comprehensive concept of working memory. Working memory involves all the ways that we take short-term information and stash it in our long-term stores, and increasingly we think of it as involving both explicit and implicit processes. When we store information consciously and actively, that's an explicit process. We make the most of this aspect of working memory when we study, for instance, so that we can know that Athens is the capital of Greece and that Pompeii was a Roman town and not a Greek one. This is how we capture facts and knowledge that we think we're going to need. Like I told you, specifically to remember Leonidas's name, you concentrated on that detail and filed it away, if briefly. But of course we're not conscious of every tiny thing that we take in, yet our working memory often transfers stuff we're not aware of to long-term storage. We call that an implicit process, the kind you don't have to actively concentrate on. A good example might be classically conditioned associations, like if you get all sweaty and nervous at the dentist because you had a root canal last year. You don't need to pull up that file on the last time you got your face drilled on to think, oh, oral surgery, not my favorite. Instead, implicit processes cover all that stuff automatically. This kind of automatic processing is hard to shut off. Unless you got something unusual going on in your brain, you might not have much choice but to learn this way, like how you learned how to not put your hand into a fire. That learning would have happened pretty much automatically as soon as you first yanked your hand away from an open flame. Whether those things are lodged in there explicitly or implicitly or both, there are also different kinds of long-term memory. For instance, procedural memory refers to how we remember to do things like riding a bike or reading. It's effortful to learn at first, but eventually you can do it without thinking about it. Long-term memory can also be episodic, tied to specific episodes of your life. Like remember that time that Bernice fell out of her chair at chemistry and everybody started laughing uncontrollably? Man, good times. There are other types of long-term memory too, and we're continually learning more about the biology and psychology of the whole complex phenomenon. For instance, while Clive Waring's episodic memories, among others, seem to be deeply affected, his procedural memories for things seem to be in one piece. This has to do with neuroanatomy that we do not have time to explore here and that we don't yet fully understand. Waring and others have a lot to teach us about the different types of long-term memory storage. Now, for healthy memories, there are lots of little tricks you can use to help remember information. Mnemonics, for one, help with memorization, and I'm sure you know a few that take the form of acronyms. Roy G. Biv for the colors of the rainbow, for instance. Mnemonics work in part by organizing items into familiar, manageable units in a process called chunking. For example, it may be hard to recall a 7-digit number, but it'll be easier to commit to memory in the rhythm of a phone number, 867-5309. Or you could just write a song about it. Strategies like mnemonics and chunking can help you with explicit processes, but how well you retain your data can depend.
Okay, now we're going to move on to another huge point, and this dovetails off of that last, that very first example there in the beginning there, where the man just knows he loves and adores his wife, right? That is something that's a strong emotional pull. Well, this is very interesting. It's related to this concept of memory enhancement effect, which has to do with the idea that the stronger the emotional link, the stronger the long-term memory. So this is one of those things that we don't really leverage enough, maybe in school context, but getting kids to be highly motivated because they like something, they love the topic, they're deeply interested in the things themselves, they have authentic situations in which they're learning, is a huge way to enhance the probability of memory and therefore learning. We don't leverage this nearly enough in schools, I think. This is not only due to the distinct neural networks, but also to chemical changes in the brain related to consolidating those long-term memories in different networks than they would be for a normal semantic learning of information. For example, you learn a foreign language and you're in love with the guy teaching you, you'll have a different kind of link or connection to that memory than you would have just learning through a semantic neural pathway, okay? So one of the best examples of that is probably the Live Inside video related to affective neuroscience. There is the possibility that you can get different types of information into distinct overlapping neural pathways in the brain so you can retrieve these memories. For example, if they might be lost in a cognitive sense, could you retrieve the memory from an emotional pathway that would be distinct from purely semantic neural pathway, for example? Let's have a look.
What do you think of music?
My heart belongs to music. I love it.
Have you ever had music just hit you in a place that immediately brought you to tears? Music has that power.
Music connects people with who they have been, who they are, and their lives. Because what happens when you get old is all the things you're familiar with and your identity are all just being peeled away.
We're going to do your
healthcare system imagines the human to be a very complicated machine. We have medicines that can adjust the dials. Blood pressure, oh, turn that down. Blood sugar, oh, turn that down. We haven't done anything to touch the heart and soul of a patient.
One resident that barely opened her eyes, she didn't respond. Knew her for 2 years. Once we put the iPod on her, she started shaking her feet. She started moving her head. It was amazing.
Music has more ability to activate more parts of the brain than any other stimulus.
Who am I? Huh? Who am I? I'm your daughter.
By exciting or awakening those pathways, we have a gateway to stimulate and reach somebody who otherwise is unreachable.
It can't get away from me if I'm in this place.
Takes me back to my school days. Oh, God, that's beautiful.
Does it make you happy to sing for us?
Yeah. I'm crying.
Every human being needs stimulation from the outside, from little babies to old people.
American culture is wrong. There is actually life beyond adulthood. There's the opportunity to live and grow and become elders. The aging that we experience holds in it very important learnings and lessons.
There is no pill that does that.
Excuse me.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, so there's tears of joy.
Yeah,
I thought you were going to grow wings.
I was trying.